So now we're going to take what we were looking at in the last session to do with God's will and kind of seeing a bit more, exploring a bit more how that applies to us. So we're going to be looking at decision making and how do we take our understanding of God's will and bring that into, that moment when you've got to make a decision. Do you buy this thing or do you buy that? Do you choose to go on this job or that job? Do you move to this place or that? Like, what do we do? We've got that kind of understanding of God's will. How do we then apply that in our day-to-day decision making? And I don't know how much you may have thought about like your process of decision making, like how much you've maybe reflected on like how do I make decisions and the bad decisions that I've made in my life. Like, is there a pattern on those, or when have I made good decisions? What are the kind of similarities between when I've made good decisions, like there are particular things that, oh yeah, when I was doing this or when I spoke to this person, that's when I made good decisions. I just invite you as part of this, part of the module, just to be reflective on how you make decisions. Maybe that's not something you've done before, but I do think it's really, really valuable, especially as you go into your 20s, to really think through, how you make decisions, because this is something that I keep telling students year after year after year. Like, when it comes to your 20s, yes, it's great to have opportunities and experiences and to try and achieve things, but far more important than the things that you get to do and achieve in your time as a student and in your 20s, far more important than the achieving is the who are you becoming, and in particular, like, how good are you at making decisions? Like, if you become really good at making wise, faith-filled decisions at your time at uni and in your 20s, that's going to like benefit your life way more than getting the right kind of placement or being in the right kind of house. Like, those things that you fret about, like, oh, which house am I going to live in next year? Like, those things that take up a lot of your headspace. Actually, the thing that should really take up our headspace is like, how am I making courageous, faith-filled, wise decisions? So let's do that in this session. Let's think through how we make decisions and how we can bring God more into that. And I think it's particularly helpful to think through in your last year of uni, because kind of you've been on this conveyor belt as a young person from, being a kid where, when you're very little as a baby, you don't make decisions. Those are made for you. Your parents do everything for you. And then the older you get, the more independence you get. But, you go to school and, you start in year one, and then everyone goes on to year two, so you go on to year two and then year three. And okay, you have to make some decisions as you go. Maybe you need to pick your GCSEs. Do I pick history or geography? A levels, more decisions again, and then university's like, oh flip, where do I go in the country? What do I want to study? Like, I don't know. Like, you have to make decisions. But you kind of come to you've still been on a kind of conveyor belt, like you've kind of been on this like educational conveyor belt where it's kind of like one thing after the next after the next. And then you get to the end of uni and the options are kind of wide open. Like, you've got decades of your life to live, and it's like, well, what are you going to do, and what are you going to focus on? Where's your energy going to go? And are you just going to stay on a conveyor belt where you look at, okay, what other people do? Okay, they're getting married, or they're buying a house, or they're getting this thing, or they're moving to London. Okay, I'm just going to do what other people are doing because I don't know. Or are you going to be like, actually, no, I have this field to explore. Going back to the analogy from the last session, like, there's so much that is in God's will that I could do and explore, but this is important, and making decisions here is key. And the stakes of our decisions get higher and higher, whether that's things like relationship and marriage, whether that's like a mortgage, whether it's like where you're going to bring up a family. Like, there can be some really like big decisions that feel like real high stakes, and we want God to be in that. And I'm sure already, if you are a follower of Jesus, you've been trying to bring God into that, and you want to invite him into it. So that's what we want to look at. How do we become someone who is good at making wise decisions? I thought I'd start by kind of sharing some methods that I know I have used and many other people have used that I don't think are particularly the best, but often we default to when it comes to trying to make decisions with God. So the first kind of method is the, does this feel right method, which is where we kind of just ask God to, give us a sense of peace over decisions. So, we've got to pick between three things, or we don't even have three things to pick from. We literally don't have a clue what to go for, and we're just kind of asking God, I'm going to start like picking some things, thinking of some options, and I want you to give me a sense of, oh, this feels right, or I feel at peace about it. And I think there certainly are like moments when it comes to, God's Spirit coming into decision and that giving us a sense of peace. That is totally right. But also, I think I kind of wanted to mention this one first, because actually I think our gut reaction is that if something feels right, then it's God directing us. So if we feel at peace about it, then that's must be from God. And that's not necessarily always the case. Both our logic and our feelings are part of the fall. They've been corrupted by sin, and often what might feel right isn't necessarily what God wants for us. Maybe it feels right because actually that's the thing we want, and not what God wants for us. And even I think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he knows that the Father has the cross in front of him. He knows that he's going to go and give his life. And Jesus is there saying, I don't want to do this. And Jesus definitely doesn't feel at peace in that moment. It says that he's sweating blood. Like, he is definitely not, oh, this is the right decision and I feel a peace over it, that I'm going to go to the cross because that's what the Father wants and I'm, really peacefully going to go. Actually, there's real anguish. And sometimes, the right decision is an incredibly hard decision. But just because it doesn't feel easy or right or kind of peaceful, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not of God. So that's one to balance. Like, I think there is a sense of the Spirit of God directing us and there being a peace, but don't just use that as a guide. The kind of second method that I know a lot of people use, and I've used it before as well, is what I call the pushing at different doors method, which is like, I don't really know what God wants for me, so I don't know what placement to do, so I'm just going to send out 10 applications, and whichever one happens to go through, then that will be God's will. And that's kind of using the kind of what we were talking about in the last session of like, well, God has a set plan, well, I'm just going to like scattergun approach, and then whatever one happens must be the one that God always wanted for me, and if he doesn't want me to do that, then he'll shut that door. But actually I think that's lessening the degree of autonomy and authority that God's given us in making decisions, to journey things through him. And I don't think necessarily kind of a scattergun approach where you're just like, well, I'll try it all and see what happens. That's not necessarily being guided by the Spirit. And then the third one is trying to find like an answer in the Bible, like, oh, I need to make this decision of where to live or what to do or what to study. What does the Bible say? And well, we're often quite disappointed because there's so much of the Bible that, I guess there are lots of bits of the Bible that are kind of specific things about how we should live, but there's just loads of stuff that doesn't really get touched on in the Bible in terms of our day-to-day life and decisions we make. And often people will try and find some magic verse or something in the Bible that's like a sign that I need to do this. I know my mum, when she came to the end of her school days, she opened up the Bible randomly, put her finger down, and there was a verse about a lady who nursed a child back to health, was the verse. So she became a child nurse off the back of that. Now, it worked out for her, but I'd say that's very much the exception. I definitely don't recommend it as a way of making big decisions in life. Like, ultimately, there's no kind of magic verse that'll suddenly appear that'll tell you exactly what to do. So how do we go about it? Like, if those three aren't particularly wise ways of making decisions, then how do you do it? And if you're anything like me, like, you just want God to tell you. You just want Jesus to be like, oh, you've been like having sleepless nights over whether you do this or that. Well, Andy, here's the answer. And if you're anything like me, maybe you're frustrated that, oh, if only Jesus was around here, like physically today, if only we were like the disciples, I can imagine the disciples, whenever they had like something they were unsure of, they could just go to Jesus, say, God, do I do this or do I do that? And he just gave them an answer. It would have been a lot easier. Well, actually, when you look at the Gospels, I don't think it would be any easier if Jesus was around us physically than it is for us, because I've got some fun stats for you here. So Jesus has questions asked of him over 180 times in the Gospel. So over 180 times someone comes and asks a question of him. In total, Jesus answers 3. So in terms of like directly answering what the person asked, only 3 times does Jesus give an answer. And actually, over 300 times, Jesus asks questions of others. So there's over 300 questions from Jesus to the people in the Gospels, and only 3 answers that he gives back. Jesus asked far more questions than he gave answers. And you were like, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, why would Jesus do that? Is he trying to be like deliberately like confusing it? Actually, no. There's a key principle here that is so important for us to learn, which is that Jesus doesn't just want obedient followers. He wants people whose hearts are transformed. And as you read through the Gospels, you just have these moments where someone comes to him with a question like, is it right to give taxes to this person or that person? Is it right to do this or that on the Sabbath? Like questions of like black and white, like, is this right or is this right? And instead he comes back with a parable or a story, or he comes back with a question where he's not directly saying, well, it's X or it's Y. He comes with a question or parable that kind of twists it on its head and says, well, actually, what's your motive? What's your desire? And that's what he's trying to get at often. Jesus is trying to get at the motive and the heart's desire of the person asking the question, because he's not just interested in, setting right from wrong. His first concern is like, what is your heart, motive and desire in this? So, for example, if I have two options, X and Y, and I ask God, I'm asking God about, which one is it? And I really want it to be option X, that's the one that I want, but then God clearly tells me, no, you need to do Y. Then there is a merit and like faithfulness in me going, well, I want to do X, but God's telling me Y, okay, I'm going to grit my teeth and do Y. And there is like a faithfulness in doing that. Even Jesus, the God of Gethsemane, he does, he says, not my will, but yours. He's like, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to be obedient. There is a time and a place where God directly says, no, do this, and it is obedient to follow. But I'd say the majority of the time in the Bible, it's not about like, well, I know I want to do X and God's told me to do Y, I'm going to grit my teeth and do it. Jesus doesn't answer, is it X or Y? He's like, actually, I don't want you to do something just because that's what I told you to do. I want you to choose what I would choose. I want your heart to be transformed first. I want your motives to be deconstructed and rebuilt around what I value, what I care about, so that the option that you end up choosing is the one that God would choose. Like that's key principle as we read the Gospels and the New Testament. It's about heart transformation and being like Jesus in what we choose. And so it's very frustrating that Jesus doesn't give us clear answers. He didn't give clear answers in the Gospels, but I think this is why. Because he's like, I don't want you to just do something because I've told you to. I want your heart to be transformed first. So every time you come to those moments of like, oh, there's these options, what do? Don't just get frustrated with God not saying, oh, he's not given an answer, he's not said what I should do. Use that as an opportunity to be like, God, what are you telling me here about my motives and desires? Where do I need to hand things over to you? I'd love to talk more about this in our catch-ups, but I just wanted to end with kind of 3 more practical tips. Hopefully this will be a bit more helpful. 3 more practical tips of how to get better at making good and wise decisions. And a lot of these are from a pastor called Andy Stanley. I'll give a link to his talks. So the first one is a good question to ask yourself whenever you've got a decision to make, or whenever you've kind of made a decision but you're not quite sure. The question is, why are you doing this really? So the emphasis on there is on the really. Like, why are you doing this really? So when you've kind of like weighed up the option, you think, okay, I think I'm going to go for this option. Stop at that moment before you kind of commit yourself. Stop and go, why am I doing this really? And that's just a moment to be honest with yourself about like your motives and your desires, because we are really good at lying to others and to ourselves. Like I know with me when I'm making a decision of especially what I'm going to buy, if it's something that quite expensive, I kind of always really wanted it, I'll always come up with a good excuse as to why it's a good investment for work or a good investment for, I don't know, whatever it might. Like I can logically have a good case for why this is a wise, good decision, but I know I'm not being honest to myself as to what my actual desire is there. So whenever you come to a moment of decision and you're kind of weighing things up, just ask yourself, why am I choosing this one really? What are my motives here? And invite other people in. Like other people are going to be far more impartial in that than you can be. So invite other people and say, look, this is what I'm trying to say. This is what I'm trying to figure out. What are my motives in this moment? The second one is about not letting momentary desires take over your decisions when it comes to long-term decisions. And Stanley gives the example of the story of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob is at home and Esau, his brother, has been out of the house for a long time, and he comes back and he's really hungry. So Esau's really, really hungry, and Jacob's been cooking a stew or something. And Esau says, give me some food, I'm starving, I feel like I'm going to die, give me some food. And Jacob says, if you give me your part of the inheritance, or the father's inheritance, like all the family inheritance, I'll give you some food. And Esau says, well, what use is, that inheritance to me now? Like, I'm starving, like I'm really hungry. Fine, I'll give it to you. And in that moment, he gives over his inheritance in order just to get a bowl of soup. And that sounds like a silly story when you read it, but actually it reflects something key about us, that we are so blinded by our momentary desires that we give up long-term gains. I'm sure you know about this when you've been at uni, the amount of times your course is really important, but that enjoyment of watching some Netflix now, I'll just choose that now. And that's a silly example, but that will just affect you through your 20s, 30s, 40s. That will be a key thing of momentary desire will take over and cloud your vision. The momentary desire will take over what is a long-term gain that logically is what you should choose. So just always have that in your mind. Am I giving in to a momentary desire over something that's long-term? And then thirdly and finally, try and swap your thinking from a right or wrong mentality to a wise or unwise, loving or unloving. So swapping right and wrong for either wise or unwise, or loving and unloving. And by that, I'm not saying that right and wrong don't exist. Actually, I think the Bible is very clear about things that are morally right or wrong, and there's some things that are very clear. But there's a whole bunch of things in our life that aren't right or wrong. Like when I'm trying to choose what laptop to buy, there's not necessarily one make of laptop that is the right holy one, although I would say Apple is better. No, I shouldn't have said that. Other laptops are available. In those moments, you've got something to choose. Is there a morally right or wrong one? No. But thinking through okay, what is the wise or unwise decision for me here? What is the loving or unloving? How does this decision affect how I can love others well or not? And I think that's what Jesus was often coming to. When people came to him with is this the right or wrong answer? He said, no, let's not talk about right or wrong. Let's think about, is this loving or not? Is this wise or unwise? Are you thinking through that lens rather than just through the legalistic right or wrong? So those are hopefully three helpful tips and ways to think through, and I'd love to speak through it more in our group session.